talking about community, we had Ria Farrell Schalnat on the podcast, and she talked about her law career and how she discovered open source and how she got very excited to not just be aware of open source, but be able to be part of the community and work more and more in the area of open source software. Phil and I had a conversation with her about the legal community and the journey of the legal community working together in understanding open source licenses and the implications, how open source licenses are enforced through various cases throughout the history of open source. So Ria and Phil talk about an example called Groklaw in terms of how the legal community collaborated and shared information openly to their and their cases' benefit.
And I think that's a really important thing that you're identifying, because most people, when we think about open source communities, you think about the developers, but there are so many other communities that are around it, and the legal one is one of them, right? I mean, there are still great legal forums where folks get together, and that 2008 2007 timeframe was the period of Groklaw and the SCO license issues that were going on. Were you involved in that? Were you pulled into the daily happenings at Groklaw?
I was not familiar with Groklaw at that time. I became more familiar with Groklaw later on, and I was certainly aware of the SCO, but it wasn't something that I worked with directly.
Because that, for me, that was one of that showed me what incredible community there was in the legal community, because Groklaw had so many lawyers from all over the place who were quite passionate and normally very quiet. You don't see these folks until this happened, right? And this challenge, dubious legal challenge to the way open source worked at all was really in question. And such a rallying effect of the legal ecosystem. I was just, as a developer, I was shocked. I was interested in intellectual property. At that time, I'm working with Scott Peterson at HP, and Dave actually at Sun, and so forth. But yeah, the power of Groklaw was a tremendous community around legal interpretation and legal defense of open source as a concept. And you ran into the same kind of people who are just passionate about the topic, more than happy to share.
I think that's really the power behind open source, is how much people are willing to share. But it also brings up, you bringing up Groklaw, which is something I discovered later on. And it's an amazing treasure trove of information, even from a historical perspective, for someone going through that and learning about that area. There's so many resources available now for open source that are much more easily findable in today's internet than they were necessarily in the 2000s, or that they were to someone who was just starting to feel their way through open source, as opposed to someone who was really living it on a daily basis.
For someone who doesn't know what Groklaw is, can either of you just sum it up really briefly?
The Santa Cruz operation, otherwise known as SEO or SCO, they acquired the copyright to the System 5R4 Unix code, and then they made the claim that Linux was a copyrighted derivative work from that Unix code, and they started suing people. And they had they generated a tremendous amount of FUD into the entire open source ecosystem. Is this thing even valid? To a lot of companies, it really scared a lot of them. And a legal defense was met. So Groklaw was a website run by this anonymous person, known as Pamela Jones, PJ. Sorry, it's been a while to draw that one up from memory. And it's never been known who this person is. He, whoever it is, was attempted to be docked multiple times. The fact that somebody was getting close after the SCO lawsuit had pretty well been won had them leave and just left the site dormant, and one day they just walked away. But every filing went through with a comb. There was an entire legal community that would take every piece of discovery and find everything from prior art or prior existence. There was just dozens and dozens of these people who were watching this website, seeing what the next thing was that was needed in the case, and then scurrying off to go find this information and then bring it back to this collective on this website. And SEO was just so frustrated because they were just constantly being thwarted with this group of unpaid people who were coming together to defend this open source thing, because we recognized, if this case stood, it was a serious, it was Linux, it was a serious detriment to the open source ecosystem as a whole, and it was a serious threat. And so everybody just got together, and like I said, I watched this on a daily basis. I was on Groklaw every day watching what was getting posted, and the discovery and the resources that were coming to bear to protect this thing called Linux that I'm pretty sure almost none of the lawyers on that website actually used Linux, but they liked the idea, and they liked the idea of the defense, and they had other people in their company that were using it. Right. And so it was just this groundswell of defense. It was really cool.
And while open source licenses have a much better understanding today than they had like a decade or 2 decades ago, there is still ways to go for people to better understand the licenses, the license implications, and clear out some of the myths and misunderstandings that they have. And there might be an episode about this topic later in the season as well.